Clara Monroe sat in the quiet of her kitchen. The soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards, the only sounds that filled the air. The fading light of the evening bathed the room in a dull amber glow as the sun dipped. Below the horizon, it was the perfect time for reflection. She had grown accustomed to this solitude over the years, but tonight felt different. There was something in the air that unsettled her, something familiar yet menacing, like a storm waiting to break. Her eyes wandered to the old oak tree outside the window. The sight of it made her chest tighten, and for a moment, the memories from 12 years ago came flooding back. It had been 12 years since Carl Monroe disappeared. 12 years since she had buried him in the backyard beneath that very tree. The ground had been soft then, the earth yielding easily to her spade. She had made sure everything was perfect, a final act of control over the man who had spent so many years dominating her life. No one knew what happened to Carl and Clara, had made sure it stayed that way. As she stared out at the tree, a wave of guilt washed over her. It never went away, not really. She had convinced herself that she had done the right thing, that she had no other choice. But every night, as the clock struck 8 p.m., that guilt resurfaced with a vengeance, almost as if the hour itself held a special weight. It was always 8 p.m. when Carl would come home from work, when he would barge through the door, reeking of whiskey and anger, ready to pick a fight. It wasn't just the physical violence, although there had been plenty of that. It was the way Carl controlled every aspect of her life. The way he isolated her from everyone she loved, the way he belittled her, made her feel small and insignificant. It was a slow burn, one she had never really understood until she was so deep in it that there was no way out. At first, Carl had seemed perfect. A successful businessman with a charming smile, always the center of attention at social events. He had swept her off her feet when they met. But that was before the manipulation, before the endless games he played with her mind, before the emotional abuse, before the fear crept into her every waking moment. Clara's hand trembled slightly as she brought her teacup to her lips. The porcelain felt cool against her fingertips, and she realized she hadn't touched it in several minutes. The steam had long dissipated, but the mug remained in her hand as her thoughts drifted back in time. She had tried to remember the good moments, the happy memories. But the longer she stayed in her thoughts, the harder it became to recall anything. Other than the fear, the loneliness, the resentment, Carl had always been unpredictable. Sometimes he would come home in a good mood, charming, affectionate, but it was always a facade. He was never the man she married, not in the way she had imagined. The man she had fallen in love with was slowly replaced by someone unrecognizable, someone cruel. He wasn't just abusive, he was cunning, manipulative, and he knew how to twist everything to make it her fault. He could make her feel like the crazy one. And she believed it for a long time. But then there came the day when she realized she could no longer take it. The day she realized that if she didn't act, she would never get out. Carl had pushed her to the brink. That night, as they fought, in their kitchen, over yet another trivial issue, Carl's rage had been more than she could handle. His words, sharp and cutting, were louder than ever before. He grabbed her, his fingers closing around her throat, choking off her breath. Her pulse raced as the room seemed to darken, her vision narrowing. That's when something inside her broke. The fight-or-flight response had kicked in, and for the first time in years. She was no longer the passive victim. In that moment, Clara did what she had to do to survive. She grabbed the closest thing to her, a heavy ceramic vase, a gift from their honeymoon, and she swung it at his head with all the force she could muster. The impact was sickening. Carl crumpled to the floor, his body going limp, his face striking the cold tile. The world went silent for a moment. Clara stood over him, breathless, the vase still clutched in her hand. She stared at him, disbelief. Seizing her, her mind raced. Was he dead? Had she really just killed him? She didn't know. She couldn't be sure. But she had no time to think about it. There was no turning back now. She had to act quickly, decisively. Without a second thought, she dragged his body down the stairs into the basement. The house was eerily quiet, except for the sound of her breathing. She worked quickly, wrapping his body in a tarp, as though she were performing a task she had done countless times before. It was almost mechanical. Something inside her had taken over, something primal. The grave in the backyard had been prepared days earlier. Clara had made sure it was deep enough, wide enough, and far enough from the house that no one would think to look there. She had chosen the spot beneath the oak tree for a reason. It was the place they had spent the most time together, where they had once shared peaceful afternoons before everything went wrong. Now, it would be the final resting place for the man who had tormented her for years. The earth was soft that night, the soil yielding to her spade with ease. She dug quickly, her hands moving almost instinctively, her mind shutting down. Didn't think about the consequences. She didn't think about what this meant for her future. She simply did what had to be done. By the time she had finished, the grave was ready. She carefully lowered Carl's body into the hole, covering it with soil until the ground looked untouched. She felt no remorse as she patted the earth down. With her hands, it was over. He was gone. And for the first time in years, Clara felt a flicker of hope. The nightmare was finally over. But even as the dirt settled over his grave, the guilt began to seep in. It wouldn't leave her. She had killed him. She had taken a life, his life, and buried it in her backyard. The house felt different now. The silence was no longer comforting. It felt suffocating. Every creak of the floorboards seemed to echo louder than before. The very walls seemed to whisper his name. Carl had disappeared, but he was far from gone. He was with her, lurking in the shadows of her mind, in the quiet corners of the house, in the ticking of the clock. Every night, as the clock struck 8 o'clock, she felt his presence, like he was still here, still watching her, still controlling her. But life had to go on. She couldn't stay in hiding forever. The next day, Clara reported Carl missing. She told the police a story she had rehearsed 100 times in her head. She said he had gone for a walk late at night and never returned. His sudden disappearance seemed so out of character that the authorities quickly launched a search. But no one ever found Carl. Nobody. No trace. No sign of him anywhere. As the months went by, the investigation stalled. The police had no leads, no evidence to go on, and Clara's life slowly returned to some semblance of normal. She moved on, at least on the outside. She threw herself into work, started a small business, and eventually made new friends. She even began to date again, though the thought of another man in her life made her uneasy. The memory of Carl, the real Carl, still haunted her. But as the years passed, the guilt dulled, and Clara began to convince herself that she had done the right thing. She had been a victim for so long. Now she was free. But 12 years later, that fragile sense of peace was shattered in an instant. It began with the ring of the doorbell, a sound that would change everything. The house was still. Too still. Clara sat in her living room, staring at the clock on the wall. It was 8 p.m. again, the time that had never failed to bring with it a sense of dread. The time when Carl would walk through the door after another long day of work, his mood unpredictable, always simmering with some unspoken anger that Clara could never quite understand. And now, 12 years later, this hour still seemed to carry with it an ominous weight, as if the universe itself was taunting her. As she sat on the couch, her fingers absently tracing the edges of the throw pillow beside her, Clara's mind wandered back to the beginning, to the life she once shared with Carl. The happy days, the early years when they were newlyweds, full of hope and ambition. Back then, Carl had been everything she wanted. He was charming, confident, and passionate. He had swept her off her feet, taking her on grand dates, making her feel as though she was the center of his world. But the first crack in the facade had appeared only a few months into their marriage. It was subtle at first, like a quiet storm. On the horizon, Carl's temper, which had always been quick to flare, became more frequent. Little things would set him off. A misplaced sock, an offhand comment, a brief pause in their conversation. His words would snap, his face would twist, and in the blink of an eye, the man who had once been so tender was gone, replaced by someone unrecognizable. Clara had tried to brush it off at first. She told herself it was just stress from work, that he would return to his old self once the pressure eased. But as the months passed, the cracks deepened. Carl became more demanding, more controlling. He would call her throughout the day, demanding to know where she was, who she was with, what she was doing. If she went out with friends, he would accuse her of betraying him. If she spent too long in the bathroom, he would pound on the door, shouting at her to hurry up. At first, it was easy to dismiss. It was just him being protective, she told herself. He loved her too much. But then one night, after a particularly heated argument, Carl grabbed her by the arm and slammed her against the wall. The shock of it sent Clara reeling. For the first time, she truly feared him. This wasn't the man she had married. This wasn't the man she had given her heart to. This was someone darker, someone twisted. And yet the worst part wasn't the violence. It was the way he made her feel afterward, the way he twisted the situation until she believed she was the one at fault. He apologized profusely, of course, but it was always a hollow apology, one that never seemed to mean anything when it came time to change his behavior. It was a cycle, one that Clara couldn't seem to escape. The emotional and psychological. Manipulation wore her down, eroding her sense of self-worth until she felt like she was nothing more than an extension of Carl's will. Every time she tried to stand up for herself, he would make her doubt herself, making her feel guilty for her, even suggesting that things weren't perfect between them. And yet, there was always the tiny sliver of hope that things might change. The fleeting moments when Carl would be kind again, when he would be the man she had fallen in love with, the man she thought he could still be, but that hope was shattered. One cold evening in late November, Carl came home late from a business trip as usual. His mood was foul, his eyes dark, and his words clipped. Clara had learned to stay out of his way when he was like this, knowing that even the slightest provocation could send him into a tirade. But that night, it wasn't the small things that set him off. It was her. She had made a simple decision that Carl didn't approve of. She had signed up for a community event that she was passionate about, and Carl didn't like it. He believed her time should be spent doing things that served him, not things that made her happy. He accused her of neglecting him, of putting everything else before their marriage. "I'm doing this for us," Clara had pleaded, her voice trembling with frustration. "I want to help out. I want to be a part of something that makes me feel good about myself." Carl had sneered at her. "You're always so selfish, aren't you? Always thinking about what you want, never thinking about what I need." Before she could respond, he had slapped her across the face. The sting of it left her breathless, her hand flying to her cheek in shock. Carl had never hit her like this before, never with such force. But as she stumbled back, he had grabbed her again, this time by the throat, and shoved her up against the kitchen counter. Vision had blurred, and for a moment, she thought he might kill her. She couldn't breathe. She could barely think. And then, in that instant, something inside her clicked. For so long, she had been trapped. For so long, she had lived in fear. But now, in the most primal part of her being, Clara knew that if she didn't act, she wouldn't survive. Was it just about escaping him anymore? It was about surviving, about regaining control over her own life. In that brief, terrible moment, as Carl's fingers tightened around her throat, Clara knew that the only way out was to make sure he would never hurt her again. She didn't remember picking up the vase. All she knew was that it was in her hands, heavy and solid. And then, with everything she had, she swung it at Carl's head. The sound of the vase striking his skull echoed through the kitchen. And for a split second, Clara thought it hadn't worked. But then, Carl crumpled to the floor, his body going limp, and the world seemed to stop. There was no more noise, no more shouting, just silence. Clara stood there, trembling, her heart racing as she watched him. She didn't know what to do. The enormity of what she had just done began to sink in, but it was drowned out by the overwhelming relief that flooded her. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt free. It was as if a heavy weight had been lifted from her chest. She could breathe again. But she knew that freedom came with a price. She couldn't leave Carl's body in the house. Couldn't let anyone know what she had done. No one could ever know the truth. It was the only way she could protect herself, the only way she could live without the fear of him ever finding a way back into her life. The panic set in, needed to act fast. Clara dragged his body into the basement, not thinking, just moving, on instinct. It was cold and dark down there, and as she wrapped him in a tarp and carried him outside to the backyard, the moon seemed unnaturally bright. The old oak tree loomed in the distance, its branches stretching out like skeletal arms reaching toward her. It seemed like a fitting place to end this. It's the place where they had once held family barbecues and laughter. Now it would be where Carl's life ended, in the very spot that had once symbolized their life together. Clara's hands shook as she dug. She didn't think. She just worked. Her shovel cutting into the earth, the sound of it hitting the ground echoing in the cold night air. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest, but she couldn't stop. She had to finish this. She had to make sure that Carl would never come back. The grave was shallow, but deep enough to ensure that no one would find it, at least not in the foreseeable future. As she lowered his body into the hole and covered it with dirt, Clara felt a strange detachment. She was doing this. She was making sure no one could ever discover the truth. She had taken control of her life again, in the most final way possible. But the peace she had longed for was short-lived. As she stood there, the reality of her actions began to creep in. She had killed Carl. She had buried him. And for a brief moment, Clara wondered if she would ever truly be free of the man who had controlled her life for so long. For the first few days, Clara felt relief. The house was quiet. She had no more fear of Carl's return, no more of his angry tirades. Moved on with her life, telling the police a carefully rehearsed story about Carl's sudden disappearance. The investigation, of course, went nowhere, and they couldn't find a body, couldn't find any evidence of foul play. No one had any reason to believe that Clara had killed her husband. She was just the grieving wife who had lost her partner in some inexplicable way. But no matter how hard she tried to move on, she could never fully shake the nagging feeling that Carl was still with her, that he had never really left. His presence lingered in the back of her mind, a constant reminder of the past she had tried so hard to bury. And now, 12 years later, that past had come back to haunt her. The doorbell rang, and Clara's entire world tilted on its axis. The time had come. Carl was standing at her doorstep. The air in Clara's house felt thick with tension as she stood frozen in the living room, staring at the man standing in front of her. Carl, her husband, the man she had killed, the man who had haunted her for 12 long years, and now he was here, alive, standing in her doorway, as if nothing had happened. Her mind raced, the shock so overwhelming that it felt like the world was spinning around her, like the house itself was slowly tilting off its foundation. Clara opened her mouth, but no words came out. She wanted to scream, to run, to lock the door and never look back. She wanted to deny what she was seeing, to convince herself that this was some kind of nightmare. But the man in front of her, his familiar features, his piercing eyes, the way he stood there, calmly watching her, were impossible to ignore. This was real. Carl took a slow, deliberate step into the living room, his gaze never leaving hers. His presence seemed to fill the room, overwhelming the space, as if he had returned to reclaim everything he had lost. He didn't seem angry. He didn't seem upset. He seemed pleased. As if he had known this moment was coming, and he was. Savoring it, Carl said, his voice low, but there was an undeniable edge to it. It's been 12 years, 12 long years of me wondering if I'd ever see you again, and now here I am. Clara's heart hammered in her chest, her breath shallow and quick. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to run, to get away from him, but her legs felt like they were made of lead, too heavy to move. Her mind struggled to process what was happening. How was this possible? How had Carl survived? She had made sure of it. She had buried him with her own hands. She had watched the earth close over him, sealing him in the cold ground. He couldn't be here. It was impossible. No, Clara managed to whisper, her voice trembling. You're dead. I saw you die. I buried you. Ah! Carl smiled then. A cold, twisted smile that sent a chill racing down her spine. It was the kind of smile that made you feel like prey, like you were the one being hunted. His eyes gleamed with an unsettling satisfaction, as though he found her confusion amusing. You thought I was dead, Clara, Carl said, his tone almost mocking, but you were wrong. You buried me, yes. You buried me alive, Clara. Alive. Clara staggered backward, her hand instinctively reaching out to the wall for support. She felt her legs weakening, her knees threatening to give way beneath her. This couldn't be happening. It couldn't be real. She must have hit her head when she fell. This had to be some kind of hallucination, some cruel trick her mind was playing on her. No, Clara repeated, more forcefully this time, her voice cracking. You're not him. You can't be. You died. Carl took another step forward, closing the distance between them, his movements slow and deliberate. You really think you can run from your past, Clara? You think you can bury it and forget about it? Well, you're wrong. I'm not going anywhere. I'm here now, and I'm going to make sure you pay for what you did. Clara's heart lurched in her chest as a wave of panic surged through her. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment the room seemed to spin. She had never felt so helpless, so utterly powerless in her entire life. The man she had tried to erase from her past, the man who had broken her, controlled her, and ultimately driven her to take his life, was standing in front of her, alive and well.
Ow.
With vengeance in his eyes, her mind raced, searching for an explanation, searching for a way to make sense of this. It couldn't be possible. He had to be dead. Couldn't have come back. She had buried him deep in the earth, under the oak tree, in the dead of night. No one had known. No one had suspected. The police had given up on the case after a year, with no leads and no body to show for it. She had gotten away with it. Or so she thought. Why, Clara whispered, her voice hoarse. Why are you here? After all this time, why now? Carl's smile faded, and for a moment his face became more serious, more calculating. He crossed his arms over his chest and regarded her coldly, his eyes never leaving hers. Because you need to answer for what you did, Clara, he said. You took my life, my future, you killed me, and you think you're going to get away with it. No, I'm not going to let that happen. You're going to pay for what you did. Clara's stomach twisted in knots. Her hands began to tremble uncontrollably, and she clenched her fists at her sides, trying to steady herself. She had always feared this moment. She had always known, deep down, that Carl's ghost would come back to haunt her, that one day the truth would come to light. But now that he was standing in front of her, so real, so tangible, the weight of her actions felt like a crushing burden. She had never been able to escape him, not truly. For 12 years, she had tried to rebuild her life, to forget what she had done. She had created a new identity for herself, a successful businesswoman, a woman with friends, a woman who could stand on her own 2 feet without fear. But all of it was an illusion. Carl had always been there, lurking just below the surface of her mind, waiting for the day he would return. Clara took a step back, her mind racing as she desperately searched for a way out. She couldn't let him do this to her. She couldn't let him tear apart everything she had worked for. But she didn't know how to fight him. She didn't know how to stop him. He'd come back, and there was no way to undo the damage he had already done. I don't know what you want from me, Clara said, her voice rising with a mixture of fear and defiance. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I'm not going to let you destroy my life again. Carl's eyes narrowed, and he took another step toward her. You don't get it, do you? This isn't a game, Clara. This is the reckoning. This is the moment where you face what you did to me. You thought you could bury me, bury your guilt, and go on living like nothing ever happened. But you were wrong. You can't hide from the truth forever. Clara shook her head, her chest tight with anxiety. I didn't want to kill you. Don't understand. You were going to kill me. You were going to destroy everything. I had no choice. I had to do it. I had to survive. Carl's face softened slightly, but the coldness in his eyes never wavered. You could have left me. You could have walked away. But you didn't. You chose to kill me. And now, you're going to pay for it. The words hit Clara like a physical blow, and for a moment she felt dizzy. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably, and she stumbled backward, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She didn't know what to say anymore. She had never expected this, never expected him to come back, never expected the past to surface so violently. Her whole life had been a lie, built on the foundation of her guilt. And now, Carl was here to expose everything. Just then, the doorbell rang again. Clara's heart skipped a beat. It was too much. The weight of Carl's words, the crushing guilt, the fear of losing everything, It was all too much to bear. Carl looked at her, an almost amused expression on his face. "Go ahead, answer it. It won't change anything." Clara's head spun. She didn't know what was happening, didn't know how to process what was going on. But she knew one thing for sure. Carl was right. There was no escaping the past. No matter how far she ran, no matter how much time had passed, Carl was here to make her face the consequences of her actions. And there was no way out. With a shaky hand, Clara reached for the door, her legs weak beneath her. As she opened it, the figure standing on the doorstep made her freeze in terror. Detective Samuel Foster. Clara's breath caught in her throat. How could he be here? What did he want now? The detective's cold eyes met hers, and for a brief moment, the air seemed to thicken with the weight of everything Clara had kept hidden for so long. "I'm afraid I'm here to ask you a few questions." "Clara," Detective Foster said, his voice calm but firm. "About your husband's disappearance?" The door creaked shut behind Clara with a soft, almost imperceptible sound, but it felt like the earth itself had shifted. Detective Samuel Foster stood there, his eyes scanning the room with the practiced gaze of someone who had seen too much. Of the darker side of life, his presence sent a wave of cold through Clara's body. The breath she had been holding rushed out of her in a sharp gasp. "Detective," Clara said, her voice thin and brittle. "What are you doing here? This is not the right time." "I'm not ready for visitors." Foster's eyes, like those of a hawk, never left her face. He took a step inside, brushing past her without a word, and immediately began inspecting the room with a slow, deliberate scan. There was a familiarity to his movements, an air of quiet authority that made Clara's heart pound in her chest. How long had it been since she'd seen him last? 12 years? Felt like a lifetime. But the truth was, she never stopped thinking about the detective, about his suspicion, his lingering gaze, and his relentless pursuit of the truth about Carl's disappearance. Even when she thought she had gotten away with it, even when the police closed the case, she had always known he had doubts. And now, here he was, back at her doorstep. "Clara," Foster said, his voice gravelly and measured. "I hope you don't mind me showing up unannounced, but I've been doing a little digging. I'm still following up on the investigation, you know. Carl's disappearance. It's never truly been solved. The case is still open." Clara's breath hitched, her pulse thundering in her ears. How could he still be obsessing over Carl? The investigation had gone cold so many years ago. The case was closed. There was nothing more to uncover, nothing more to question. But the look in Foster's eyes told her everything she needed to know. He was convinced something wasn't right. He would never let this go. Not until he had an answer. Clara shifted on her feet, her legs feeling like jelly beneath her. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to run, to hide, to somehow erase this moment and bury it deep inside, just as she had buried Carl's body all those years ago.
Ow.
But it was too late for that. Carl was here. And now, Detective Foster was here. The walls of her carefully constructed life were crumbling, piece by piece. "I don't know what you think you can accomplish, Detective," Clara said, her voice tight with an edge of desperation. "It's been 12 years. Nothing has changed. Carl disappeared. That's all we know. I've told you everything I know. I can't help you any more than I already have." Foster didn't flinch at her words, simply stared at her with that unblinking gaze as if seeing straight through her. "You're a very good liar, Clara," he said, his tone cold but not unkind. "I'll give you that. I've had my suspicions for a long time. And after all these years, I think it's time to ask you something very simple." Ace. Clara's heart sank as the question hung in the air between them, suspended like a dagger waiting to strike. "Where is Carl?" Foster asked, his voice low and deliberate. The words heavy with meaning. Clara felt her entire world tilt, the ground beneath her feet suddenly feeling unstable. She took a step back, her back hitting the wall behind her with a soft thud. The room seemed to shrink around her, the walls closing in. She could feel Carl's presence behind her, his cold eyes never leaving her, even though he hadn't spoken a word. He was the one who had returned, the one who had forced her into this corner. And now Detective Foster was here, pushing her to confront the unthinkable. "I don't know what you're talking about," Clara said, her voice hoarse. Carl disappeared. He was never found. There's nothing else to say. Foster watched her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed, a deep, weary exhale that spoke of years of frustration. You really think I believe that, Clara? You think I haven't pieced this together by now? Clara swallowed hard, her throat dry. That she wanted to scream to tell him to leave, to get out and forget everything. But she couldn't. She couldn't run anymore. Carl was right there, standing behind her, and she could feel his eyes on her, cold, calculating. Carl had come back to expose her, to make her pay. The detective was just the first step in this twisted reckoning. I know what you did, Clara, Foster said quietly, his voice taking on a tone of grim understanding. I've always known. Well, why you spoke about Carl's disappearance, the way you acted, it never added up. I spent years reviewing the case files, going over every scrap of evidence, every statement. And you know what? Came to a conclusion. Clara's breath caught in her throat and she turned toward Carl, her eyes pleading for something. Anything, but he remained silent, his gaze never leaving her. Foster's words hit her like a hammer. I think you killed him, Foster said. His voice now, a firm declaration. I think you buried him. The words echoed through the room, vibrating in Clara's mind, louder and louder. She had never thought this day would come. She had lived in fear of it for so long, but now that it was here, it was worse than she could have ever imagined. The weight of her guilt, the terror that had haunted her every waking moment, all came crashing down on her in a single instant. Didn't mean to, Clara whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. I didn't want to, but I had no choice. He was going to kill me. He was going to destroy everything. I had to survive. Foster's expression softened just slightly, as if he were beginning to understand, but there was no pity in his eyes. Only the cold, unflinching truth. And that's why you killed him, because you had no other choice? His voice, low and steady? Because he was dangerous? Clara nodded, the tears finally beginning to well up in her eyes, the dam she had built up over the years starting to break. He was killing me slowly, detective. Not just with his fists, but with his words, with his control, every day, every moment. I was suffocating. I didn't know what to do. He had me in a cage, and I couldn't escape. I thought if I could just get away, if I could just be free. Her voice cracked, and the floodgates opened. All the years of fear, guilt, and shame came rushing out in an uncontrollable tide. She sank to her knees, her hands shaking as she clutched at the carpet, unable to hold it together any longer. I didn't want to kill him. I never wanted to. But I couldn't live like that anymore. I had to do it, detective. I had to do it to survive. Foster crouched down beside her, his eyes softening just a fraction, but still, his expression remained resolute. And you buried him. You made sure no one would find him. You created a story, a life without him so you could go on. Clara's breath came in ragged sobs. She nodded, unable to look him in the eye anymore. I thought it would be over. I thought once he was gone, I could forget about it, but I never stopped thinking about it. I couldn't. It's been 12 years, detective. 12 years of pretending. I didn't do the one thing that changed everything. The one thing that ended my marriage, my life, everything. And now he's here. Foster placed a hand on her shoulder, not in comfort, but as a silent acknowledgement of the weight of her confession. You made a choice, Clara. A terrible, irreversible choice. But you have to face the consequences now. You can't outrun them. You can't hide from it anymore. Carl's back, and everything you've built since that night is on the line, Clara shook her head, her sobs slowing as she tried to pull herself together. I never thought he'd come back. I thought I was free. I thought I could move on. Moving on doesn't erase what you've done, Foster said gently. And neither does pretending it didn't happen. Clara sat there, frozen in her own turmoil, staring at the floor, her hands trembling. The weight of the last 12 years of guilt, of fear, was finally crushing her, and she couldn't escape it. Carl had returned not to take revenge in the way she had feared, but to make her face the truth. And now Detective Foster was here, with the knowledge, the pieces, all coming together in a way that made it impossible to deny. She had killed Carl, she had buried him. And now The past was coming back, dragging her into the light as Clara looked up at Foster. The tears still streaming down her face, she knew one thing for certain. The nightmare she had tried to bury had come alive. Again, and this time there would be no running from it. No more lies. No more pretending. It was time for her to pay. The weight of the truth hung heavily in the air, as though the room itself was suffocating under its pressure. Clara sat on the couch, her body slumped, her shoulders trembling, her mind still spinning from the words she had spoken, the confessions she had made. Detective Foster stood silently across from her, his expression unreadable, while Carl, who had once been her husband, her tormentor, loomed just behind her, silent and cold. The house, which had once felt like a sanctuary, now felt like a tomb. A place where the past had come alive and demanded to be confronted. The moment of Clara's confession had marked a turning point. It's the point where the past could no longer be ignored, where the truth would finally emerge from the darkness she had buried it in. But as the silence stretched on, she realized that this moment was only the beginning of something far more complicated, far more harrowing than she had ever imagined. Carl's cold eyes never left her. For a long moment, he said nothing. Clara could feel his presence like an invisible force pressing against her, reminding her of everything she had done, of everything she had tried to escape. He was the one who had come back, who had returned from the grave to claim his vengeance. But the question lingered in Clara's mind. What did he want from her now? Foster, standing off to the side, was the first to break the silence. "Clara," he said quietly, his voice almost soothing, as though trying to bring clarity to the chaos. "You've made the hardest choice you could have made, but it doesn't end here. You can't erase what happened. You've killed someone, taken a life, and you need to face the consequences of that." Clara looked at him, her eyes raw from the tears she had shed. She had known this moment was coming, but now that it was here, it felt unbearable. She had killed Carl, buried him, and lived with the burden of that lie for 12 years. But Carl's return, and Foster's unwavering pursuit of the truth, had pulled her back into the web she had tried so hard to escape. Carl, who had been watching quietly, finally spoke. His voice was low, almost purring, as though he were savoring the moment. "Do you really think the truth will set you free, Clara? It won't. You can confess all you want. You can stand before Foster and tell him everything. But it won't change the fact that you murdered me. That I am here now, standing in front of you, alive." Clara's heart sank. She could hear the anger and resentment in his voice. But there was something else, something darker, something more sinister. Carl wasn't just here for vengeance. He was here to torment her, to make her feel the weight of every choice she had made. Foster cleared his throat, his gaze flickering between Clara and Carl. "What exactly do you want, Carl?" asked, his tone sharp. "You've been alive all this time, and now you're standing here, taunting Clara with your presence. What's the point? What do you hope to accomplish?" Carl took a slow step forward, his eyes fixed on Clara, as though he were drinking in her fear. "What I want, Detective, is simple," he said. "I want her to pay for what she did. I want her to know the full weight of her actions. I want her to feel what I felt when she buried me, when she thought she could just get rid of me like I was nothing." Clara's breath hitched. She could feel his words slicing through her, opening wounds she had long tried to ignore. He had been the one to destroy her, and now he was the one who had come back to finish what he had started. But the truth was, Carl wasn't just after revenge. He was after control, just like before. And Clara knew, deep down, that if she didn't confront him now, she would never be free. "I thought I was free," Clara whispered, her voice cracking. "I thought if I just buried you, I could start over. I could live my life. But I was wrong. I didn't know how to let go of you. I didn't know how to let go of the fear you put in me." Carl's smile was chilling, his eyes gleaming with a twisted sense of satisfaction. "That's the thing, Clara. You'll never be free. Not from me. Not from what you did. I'm always going to be here. You'll always remember what you did to me. You'll always remember that you killed me." Clara turned to Detective Foster, her eyes pleading. "Please, You have to help me, she said, her voice breaking. I can't live like this anymore. I can't keep running from what I did. I've spent 12 years in fear, and now Carl is here, and I can't. Foster stepped forward, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. You don't have to do this alone, Clara, he said softly. You've already made the hardest step, the confession. Now we can begin to address the truth, and whatever comes next, we will face it together. Clara's breath hitched. She could feel his words slicing through her, opening wounds she had long tried to ignore. He had been the one to destroy her, and now he was the one who had come back to finish what he had started. But the truth was, Carl wasn't just after revenge. It was after control, just like before. Clara knew, deep down, that if she didn't confront him now, she would never be free. I thought I was free, Clara whispered, her voice cracking. I thought if I just buried you, I could start over. I could live my life. But I was wrong. I didn't know how to let go of you. I didn't know how to let go of the fear you put in me. Carl's smile was chilling, his eyes gleaming with a twisted sense of satisfaction. That's the thing, Clara. You'll never be free. Not from me. Not from what you did. I'm always going to be here. You'll always remember what you did to me. You'll always remember that you killed me. Clara turned to Detective Foster, her eyes pleading. Please, you have to help me, she said, her voice breaking. I can't live like this anymore. I can't keep running from what I did. I've spent 12 years in fear, and now Carl is here, and I can't. Foster stepped forward, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. You don't have to do this alone, Clara, he said softly. You've already made the hardest step, the confession. Now we can begin to address the truth, and whatever comes next, we will face it together. Foster turned to Carl, his gaze hardening. You've gotten what you wanted, Carl. You've been tormenting her, twisting her mind, and now you want to rub salt in the wound. But this ends now. You've played your part. It's time for the law to take over. Carl stepped back, his smile never fading. Maybe it ends here for you, Detective, but for Clara, this is just the beginning. Clara felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She had hoped that Carl's return would bring some sense of closure. But now she realized that nothing would ever truly be over for her, no matter what happened. Carl's ghost would always haunt her, and the guilt of what she had done would never fully go away. She had taken a life, and no matter how much time had passed, there would be no escaping that fact. The months that followed Clara's confession were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, emotional turmoil, and the painful process of facing her past. She had pleaded guilty to Carl's murder, and while the court had shown some leniency, the consequences were inevitable. Clara spent several years in prison, a place where she had no choice but to confront the full extent of her actions. In those years, something changed. Clara, broken and filled with remorse, began to heal. She realized that while she couldn't undo the past, she could shape her future. By the time she was released, Clara was a changed woman, no longer running from the shadows of her past, but embracing the truth and working to make amends in whatever way she could. Her future was uncertain, but she had come to terms with the fact that redemption, however fleeting, was still possible.